What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the story of my Army experience so far series. Today we're out in the backwoods of beautiful Hawaii on Oahu, a local trail that I like to come to every time I come to the island. It's actually right outside the Lightning Academy. So for you guys out there in the 25th Infantry Division, you probably know roundabouts where I am. I love coming out here and hitting the trails in Hawaii, man, because you know the views are so great. The weather's always so perfect. Sometimes it's a little rainy, but you know, if it's not raining, we're not training, right? So no big deal there. So anyway, for this video, I want to talk about and share with you guys the story on how I earned the Purple Heart during a combat deployment, what that experience was like, what actually happened, what went down. And then I really want to expound upon how that changed me, not only as a soldier, but as a person, and just gave me a whole new perspective on life and really has helped to morph me into the person that I am today. Overall, definitely a significant event in my life that I believe has changed me for the better, even though it wasn't all good things that came out of it. And I'm hoping that as I go through this story, it can give you guys out there who are interested a little bit of perspective and a little bit of understanding where I come from and why I say and do some of the things I do. And then I want to say real quick that obviously there's a lot of details about this story that I'm just not going to be able to share with you guys via YouTube, okay, for OPSEC reasons. I'm sure you understand. It's not that I'm trying to be secretive or mysterious or anything like that. It's just details that I'm not supposed to be putting out there into the interweb. So hopefully you understand that, but I'll definitely give you enough to work with so that you understand the situation of what happened, and then we'll get into everything that happened after the event and talk about family life and how the Army supported me and my family after this happened to me. All right, guys, so here's my story. So it was during my second deployment, about 3 months in to Afghanistan. Me and the rest of my unit were on a mission during the night to capture or kill a certain high value individual. And it was a very sensitive mission. There was a lot of planning that went into this mission. This was kind of like a big deal. The unit had been looking for this guy for a long time, and we finally had the opportunity to snatch him up. And so we were all excited to get after it, get to the location where we thought he would be, and get him. Now, I remember during the pre-mission brief, our EOD guy had warned the rest of the platoon that this area that we were going to was very well known for being a hot spot for IEDs. There had been a lot of instances of IED attacks in this area in the past, and I specifically remember him telling the commander of the mission that this was a high-risk mission due to that fact. Nonetheless, this was such an important mission. We executed anyways. We got out there, we got after it. So we flew in, we touched down, we set up our security positions. Everything was going pretty smooth. Turned out the individual that we were looking for was indeed there. He was there with his wife. The initial 4-man team that went into the compound to grab him had discovered that. They woke him up, they grabbed him, and they started to escort him, his wife, and what appeared to be a baby that the wife was carrying that was wrapped up in a blanket. They were escorting them outside the compound while the rest of us were still outside pulling security. And that is when everything went to shit. Turned out that the baby that she was carrying was actually a rolled up suicide vest that she was just pretending was a baby. And she detonated that vest as the team were escorting them outside of the compound. That was the first detonation that night. And so when that happened, I was in a security position that was one of the closest security positions to where the explosion happened. I was one of the closest positions to the breach. And so I saw the blast, I saw it happen. I could hear the wounded soldiers that took the blast crying out for help just moments after it happened. They all survived, thank God, but they were not in a good way. Now our unit's TTPs, and I think this would go for a lot of units out there, if there were to be an IED that struck a dismount like that, the first thing you do is just stop and assess the situation, because the last thing you want to do is start running around all over the place and set off secondaries or tertiaries. And so that's what we did. You know, I could hear in my Peltors, everybody was trying to assess the situation. Everybody was trying to tell the rest of the team what was going on, what they saw, what they could hear, and developing a plan of action that we could execute that would make sense in the safest way possible so that there wouldn't be any additional casualties. Now, after what seemed like forever, when in reality it was only a few minutes, after just a few minutes, one of the other soldiers that I was in that security position with was starting to get really antsy about the situation, because again, we could hear the soldiers crying out for help. And this specific soldier was actually on a short-term assignment to support the unit that we were with. And this soldier had come from a history of being a nurse prior. This soldier knew that we had to get to these casualties as fast as possible, because that would significantly increase their chances of survival. But I kept telling the soldier we had to wait. We have to wait a little bit longer, just because there could be secondaries, and we just have to assess the situation first. Eventually, it just became too long of a wait. I told this soldier to stay in the position, don't move. I'm gonna go up and I'm gonna try and help where I can. And I did. And that was the last time that I saw that soldier. And I wish I could talk a little bit more about that specific moment and that specific soldier, because the amount of disregard for personal safety that soldier, the selfless service and the sacrifice that soldier was willing to put into that moment was infinite. And it was amazing to see that. And ultimately that soldier paid the ultimate price, gave their life to save another. Okay, so that's why I did not ever see that soldier again. But that happened after I had left that position. So I left the position, I came up on the downed soldiers, and there was two of them in the position that I got to. One of them was on the ground and knew that they had, you know, severe burns and wounds to their legs. They were bleeding at the legs. Wasn't too bad, but, you know, assessed it, slapped a tourniquet on it just in case. And the other soldier, while I was doing this, and as I was putting the tourniquet on, by the time I got done putting the tourniquet on, I looked up at the other soldier. He was still standing right there, kind of in shock. And I said, "What's wrong with you, man?" And he just looked down at me, laid down on the ground, and said, "I don't know what's wrong with me." And so I started assessing him. Turned out he had some very significant wounds as well on his legs, so we slapped a tourniquet on that. I told him to drink water, pull security, we'll wait for the medevac bird to arrive, which was the same birds that had dropped us off on the objective. They just turned around because everything had happened so fast. So we only had to wait a few minutes. And as I was telling them to pull security, I had both of them pulling out, laying down, pulling out, making sure they were drinking water to help with their circulation and things, since they had already bled a lot. I turned around on a knee, and as I turned around to face outward security, that's when I had apparently hit a pressure plate IED. So apparently I had been dancing around this pressure plate IED the entire time I was giving first aid to these soldiers and didn't know it. But once I turned around, I definitely knew it, and I took the blast, shot me back at least 20 or 30 meters over the other guys, and I ended up landing on my front. I was completely disoriented. I kind of pushed myself up, got onto my knees, couldn't see a thing, couldn't hear a thing, started to touch myself all over just to make sure everything was still there. And by the time I got to my face, I could feel that my face was more or less like hamburger, or at least like one side of it was. It just felt really puffy, bloody, gushy, wet. And I immediately thought, okay, I'm blind, I'm deaf, I just got blown the hell up. And now I am probably like a two-faced guy. My wife isn't gonna love me anymore. My kids are gonna be scared of me, and my Army career is over. And that all just sunk in right there in that moment. And honestly, guys, the number one emotion that I was feeling in that moment was anger. So as I touched my face and realized that, I just punched the ground, I sat on my butt, and I just gave up for a moment. I probably just sat there and sulked for 30 seconds to a minute. I guess I was just completely in shock, thinking my life was over. I didn't even really think about my injuries or anything like that. It was more just how pissed I was that it just happened. But then one of the guys that was pulling security that I was with in the position, he low crawled over to me and I couldn't really see him because it's dark. I was blinded by the blast. My radio was to shit and I was kind of deafened, but I could hear and I kind of could see enough of the outline of him that he was low crawling over to me, and he got right up on me and just said, "Sergeant, are you okay?" And I just looked down at him and said, "No, man, I'm rocked up." You know, all jacked up. He took a second, paused, and said, "Okay," and then turned back around and went right back to his security position. And I'll never forget that. But him doing that in that moment, it kind of hit me like, wait, we're still on mission. There's still shit that needs to get done. This isn't over yet, regardless of how I'm feeling. So I pulled myself together, I crawled back over to the position, and I pulled security, and we waited for the bird. I had to tell them, hey, look, my radio's gone. I can't see a thing. I need to know when the medevac is arriving so that we can move ourselves to the medevac when it comes. And they understood, and we waited. Now, as we were waiting, this was the second blast of the night, okay? As we were waiting, there was still other things happening all around us. We didn't know what was happening, but every now and then we would hear explosions, we would hear yelling, there'd be flashes all around us. Myself, and I imagine the other guys, just kind of assumed that there was contact, that they were using grenades. You know, and our unit was always so well against fighting other forces that I didn't have a whole lot of worry about it. I just thought that's what was going on. Later on, we found out that there was a lot more going on in the background. There were more IEDs going off. There were more casualties that were happening. But in the moment, I had no idea, to be honest. We waited a few more minutes, and then I finally got a tug on the shoulder. One of the soldiers told me, hey, the medevac bird has landed. We need to go this way for about 200 to 300 meters. And my immediate reaction to that was, shit, that sucks. That's pretty far because you guys can't walk and I can't see. This is gonna be tough to pull off. So what we did was, since I could still walk, I took a middle position in between the other two guys, helped them walk, and they helped to guide the way towards the medevac. So we're walking in a three-man group like this. I had one soldier on each side. We're walking towards the medevac bird for 200 to 300 meters. Seemed like forever, because as we were doing that, again, there's yelling, flashes, you know, a whole bunch of activity going on in the background that we really had no idea what the actual situation was. We just knew, hey, there's two guys that are potentially bleeding out, and there's another guy that we don't even know what's going on with him. We just know his face is trash and he's bleeding all over his chest and shoulders. So we walked the entire trek towards the bird. I don't even remember, honestly, how long it took. I mean, it felt like a really long time, but it probably wasn't too long. We get to that bird, and as we get there, there's already more casualties there, more than the initial casualties that happened at the breach, the first two, the other two guys. And the PJ, the medic, was just saying, get on the bird, get on the bird. And so we're following instructions and we're hurrying up and getting on the bird. He puts the other two guys in stretchers on the floor. He grabs me by the shoulders, assesses me real quick, and tells me to sit down on one of the seats and drink as much water as I can. And at this point, I'm still kind of in shock. I'm just following directions, trying to figure out what the hell is going on, and drinking as much water as I can, because I knew the reason he said that was because I must be bleeding a lot. So I'm sitting there on the bird. Maybe another minute or two goes by, more casualties come on. Eventually we take off and we start making our way to the fob. And as we're in flight, I start thinking about what had just happened a little more, assessing myself a little more. Still can't see a thing, still can't hear a thing. All I know is that I'm really wet all over, so I'm bleeding everywhere. I could feel the blood dripping from my face like in a constant stream. And I just felt like this entire side of my face was just mush. It's just what it felt like, you know? And I was so dizzy and disoriented that I barely even remember the time from when we landed to when we got transferred to a medevac Humvee and made our way to the FOB's like hospital. I don't even really remember that because I was just so out of it. I couldn't really understand what was going on. I just remember there was a bunch of people grabbing me and like everything was going so fast, and they were ripping off my clothes. They kept putting flashlights in my eyes. Like, that happened a whole lot, and I could see it enough that I knew they were putting light in my eyes, but I couldn't see who was doing it or what was going on around me. They were just handling the entire situation. For me, I had full faith and confidence in the entire situation because it seemed like they knew what they were doing. It was very professional. It was very hectic, but it was also very controlled, or at least it seemed that way. They cut off my plate carrier. They cut off all my clothes. They cut off my boots. They cut everything. Everything was completely destroyed. And by the time everything was over, I just found myself waking up in a hospital bed, drugged out of my mind, and just with bandages like all over my face. My eyes had bandages on my eyes. I couldn't see anything, could barely hear anything. I had like a constant ringing in my ears. And I just remember there was other soldiers from that mission around me in other beds talking about how they were trying to figure out what had happened because the situation was still going on and there were still other soldiers rolling in that were wounded. I started to talk with the other soldiers and try to figure out the situation. We had learned that over the course of those few hours, and even after we were medevaced, there were more medevacs that had to go out because, I mean, there was almost, I think it was around 50 casualties from that site. It was in Moscow. 50 casualties that were wounded in some way, some worse than others. 4 KIA and 2 enemy KIA. And to be honest, in the moment, that was just horrible to hear, and that was really all I could focus on. That was all any of us could focus on. Nobody really had a grasp of what really happened that night or a complete story until weeks or even months after the incident, once everybody started piecing the entire story together one by one. And I have a whole lot of more understanding of what went on that night and what the actual blasts were. They weren't grenades. What all the yelling was about. There's a lot more sub-stories for what had happened that night, but I'm not going to get into it just because, for the sake of all them, and just because I think it would violate some sort of OPSEC, so I don't want to do that. But back to where I was in the hospital, it must have been maybe 6 hours after the fact. They had already started rolling in higher ups from all across the AO to come issue out Purple Hearts for everybody. And so the way I actually was given or awarded the Purple Heart was there in the hospital with my eyes bandaged, bleeding, and drugged out of my mind. They picked up about 4 of us at a time, put us in a wheelchair or gurney or walked us, whatever our specific situation was, whatever our capability was, moved us to a few rooms over, and they did Purple Heart ceremonies right there in this small little room. They talked about what happened, asked us some questions, thanked us for our service in a very professional way. Like, I won't ever forget it. It was actually really cool the way this happened. And they pinned us our Purple Hearts, and the way mine was pinned, because I was still all jacked up, I had blood still running through my bandages onto my chest from my face, that my Purple Heart that I actually got that day still has blood on it on the top. And for me, it makes it even that much more special. So I'm gonna hold on to that one for the rest of my entire life. So I stayed at that hospital for the night, and then they had to move me to another more advanced hospital that was still in Afghanistan, but I had I guess an emergency situation where I still had shrapnel in my left eye, and they wanted to try to save the eye. They didn't think they were going to be able to save my eyesight. They thought they could at least save the eye. So I went and got emergency eye surgery at another hospital, still jacked up, didn't really know what was going on. And then the picture on the thumbnail that you see where I'm kind of messed up, that is really one of the only pictures I have from the event, because I was right before I went into this surgery. The nurse was talking to me, and I asked her to take a picture of it and email it to me, just so I had some sort of picture of what was going on for later, because I really had not seen myself since the event happened. The surgery ended up being successful. They told me they got the shrapnel out, that as long as it didn't get infected, I'd be able to keep the eye, but I probably am not going to be able to see out of it anymore, or at least very well out of it anymore. Ended up going from there to another place, and eventually all the way back stateside to Walter Reed, where I went through a whole bunch of other procedures and recovery in the ICU, and basically stayed as an inpatient for another 30 days. And during that 30 days, long story short, I obviously healed up miraculously. You could barely even tell, right? Regained my vision, regained my hearing and regain my ability to walk in a straight line, because one of the things I noticed was that I was so disoriented from the blast that I couldn't even really walk straight, and I definitely couldn't walk backwards. In fact, when I went and saw the TBI physical therapy doctor one day, they wheeled me over there, and she started talking to me about how much recovery it was going to take to be able to walk straight again. And I told her, I'm fine. This is not an issue. I can walk straight. I don't even know why I'm in a wheelchair right now. She said, oh yeah? Stand up. I stood up. I said, see, I'm fine. And she said, okay. They moved the wheelchair out from behind me. And she said, okay, walk backwards. And I said, all right. And I walked backwards, took one step, fell right onto my ass because I just couldn't walk backwards. So it took a little time to get better there. But eventually, after everything was said and done, back to full health, good to go. Before I actually left for Walter Reed, the chaplain had come to visit us at the first hospital where all the wounded were filtering into. And he was coming around, giving us a phone to use so that we could make phone calls to our loved ones and make sure to inform them of the situation before they got word any way else, which would have been a violation of OPSEC, of course, but it was such a big event, I guess, that there was a chance of that happening. So I called my wife, and she answered, and she actually had just gotten surgery herself. She had just gotten like her ankle repaired because she had an ankle injury. So she had just gotten done with surgery herself. I told her that I had been hurt on a mission and I'm okay. I still have my legs, I still have my arms, but my face was pretty jacked up, and no matter what, she still has to love me. And I think she was kind of in shock by the whole thing. I think she even might have thought I was like joking with her or something, but she was like, of course I'll still love you. It doesn't matter what has happened to you. Of course I'm gonna love you. Are you being serious right now? Are you being serious? What do I need to do? Where do I need to be? What is happening now? I told her just, I'm not really sure what's gonna happen. I'm sure the Army's gonna contact you. It sounds like I'm coming back home early. So I'll see you when I get there. By the time I got to Walter Reed, I got put into the ICU, and I think it was only maybe a half hour later, and here she comes in on crutches to come be with me. The Army had flown her out from where we were living, from our home, to come be with me in the ICU. And she stayed with me during the entire recovery process in my room, in the same bed. She had her own room at the Fisher house that they had secured for her, but she didn't leave my side. She stayed with me the entire time. As the nurses would come and check in with us, as we'd do our appointments and stuff like that, the nurses would change their shifts, so we'd get new nurses like almost every day or every other day. And every time there was a shift change, they'd come in and be like, wait a minute, who's the patient here? Because like I said, I was all jacked up, and then my wife had like a cast on. But I could never thank her enough for staying there with me, especially being injured like that herself. I mean, it must have been hard, but that was great that the Army was able to provide that for us. And I can't thank them enough for that as well. And there was a whole lot of other things that came from the Army as far as support goes. There was a whole bunch of support groups that came to visit, offering supplies, monetary funds for travel or whatever else we might need. There's representatives from the CARE Coalition that came. My commander and first sergeant at the time came to visit. All sorts of support as far as the Army goes specifically, to come and make sure that I was doing okay and that I was gonna be okay and see this through. I'll never forget all the support that I received during the time that I was healing up. Also during that time, I had plenty of time to think about my life, think about what was important to me, because I realized I had nearly escaped not only death, but being completely paralyzed for the rest of my life. And so that was the time where it really sunk in for me that you never really know when your time's gonna come. I realized that there was a lot of things I still wanted to do in my life, and there was things that I was kind of waiting on or being lazy about or taking for granted or not taking seriously, that in that moment, in that time, I realized I need to stop doing that, and I needed to start taking more control of my own life and what I wanted to get out of my life. And there's all sorts of things, primarily family life, career life, and just things that I wanted to be able to experience in my life in general. I knew that as soon as I healed up, I had to take those things more seriously and get after it. Stop being lazy, stop making excuses for myself, because there may be a time, and that time is a time that is unknown, that all of it can be taken away from me in an instant. So even though the entire situation was a tragedy, you know, and I don't mean to say that for myself, but for a lot of the other individuals that were affected that night, especially the ones that aren't with us anymore. But sometimes it takes a tragedy like that to really realize what is truly important to you. And for me, myself, that was absolutely one of the biggest life-changing events of my entire life, and has set me into a new trajectory ever since on going forward and never stopping until I reach what I'm after. I should never sell myself short. I should never quit, because even if I'm giving full effort to something, it can still be taken away from me in an instant. So I need to give max effort at all times to the things that are important to me. And all this happened, you know, before I went to get a commission, before I went to Ranger School, before I started Gritty Soldier, all the things that have been really difficult to do in my life, you know, this happened before that. So that's my story, guys. And again, you know, there are a lot more details to it, but hopefully that was conveyed enough in a manner that was easily understood, and the story could be pieced together enough where it actually made sense. I'm hoping that that was inspirational enough to where it doesn't take a tragedy like that for you to be able to flip the switch and remember and focus on what is truly important to you and do those things. Because again, you never know when you're not going to be able to get the chance to do it anymore. All right, guys, so that's the basic roll-up of my Purple Heart story. I do hope it was beneficial to you in some way. I think the next chapter to this series will be about how I went about deciding to earn a commission in the Army, go from an NCO to becoming an officer, and what that path was like, and a little bit on how it turned out for me. And that was actually a really big chapter of my life as well, so that should be a pretty good video with a lot of good solid information for you, especially if you're looking at doing something like that yourself. But for now, guys, I'm gonna go ahead and continue to enjoy this beautiful day in Hawaii, continue on with my ruck training. So besides that, I've got nothing else for you. I'll see you on the next one.